There's something about farming in video games that relaxes me. After a long day of work, I like to open up a can of Dr. Pepper and spend a few hours tending my crops. The world would align and everything would feel right again, but what if I could also tame creatures in turn-based battle? Well, Moonstone Island is here to show what farming and creature collection can do to a man. Moonstone Island opens up on the player character, only known as the Alchemist, as they're napping on a floating island. It isn't long before the appropriately named father decides to spring some impromptu training on the Alchemist before sending them off on their own on a magic broom. During their initial flight, a storm happens to be passing by one of the other islands, forcing the Alchemist to crash land and destroying their broom. Now the player, trapped on Moonstone Island, must complete their training and help the small population with their problems within the span of a year. They'll be diving through dungeons, taming creatures, and perhaps discovering a little thing we like to call love along the way. I'll admit that a few things about this introduction to Moonstone Island felt too familiar at first, with my initial thought being that it was already feeling like Kiki's delivery service, since both parents are sending their child off on a magic room to finish their training in some magic art. It isn't until I started interacting with the townsfolk that the charm of the story started to shine through. Most of the townsfolk are surprisingly friendly, especially to a new alchemist that unexpectedly crashed into their lives. However, each resident will warm up to players at different speeds. For example, Farah, the local blacksmith, and Osono, the innkeeper, are both outgoing and love to talk, making them particularly easy for players to get affection points from by talking every day and giving gifts. On the other hand, Guyana, the little sister of the local botanist, and Rowan, the storekeeper, are more reserved, and will take longer for players to build any sort of relationship with. The other characters, Paolo the carpenter, Chloe the archaeologist, Zed a spirit researcher, Ophelia the botanist, Tobin a laid-back fisher, and Quill, who helps out at the inn, are more neutral towards the player. However, these stances make each of the characters memorable and feels more rewarding when getting those more reserved characters to open up, with the game even having them talk about happenings between them and the other characters. This simple little choice of having the dialogue include the other characters and past topics outside of date events makes the town feel alive. However, one thing does stick out with the characters, and that's how you gain affection points. In most other titles in the genre, simply talking to the person is enough to gain a small amount of affection. In Moonstone Island, there are 3 options to choose from when talking to any villager: chat, joke, and flirt. These options come with a stated percentage of success, with chat being the highest at 70% when being at less than a single heart of affection. When the interaction succeeds, players will gain affection, but if it fails, then the number will fall. I know that this is supposed to simulate real life, that sometimes a joke may not go over well or a topic offends the other person. To me, it feels too forced and out of my control, as there are times where I initiate a conversation just to be worse off than if I had ignored the character. Although the date scenes more than make up for the daily interactions, as these not only give further insight into each character, but a small glimpse into the world itself. For example, when I was on a date with Ophelia, she talked about being older than everyone else on the island by at least 5 or so years, and how everybody would come to her for advice, so she would know who had a crush on who and what was going on. One of the biggest revelations that the characters will sometimes mention is that the world was torn apart, which is why they have to live on floating islands now. This kind of information is a good example of world building that, while it isn't important, can show why alchemists are even needed in the first place. This includes the taming of wild spirits that have been increasingly agitated and attacking people. These spirits have different typings: earth, water, poison, psychic, electric, and fire. Each of course will have an advantage over another type that players will need to pay attention to succeed in battle. The flow of combat is pretty simple for newcomers to deck-building systems to understand. Each spirit in the party will have a set amount of cards inside their deck that get shuffled together. At the start of the turn, the player will draw 5 cards from the deck and have 3 energy. Each card will have an energy cost associated with it, and the more utility and damage a card will do, the more energy it'll cost. Spirits have both an HP and armor stat, where armor represents the amount of damage that can be blocked from an attack, and HP needs to be whittled down to defeat a spirit. Players can influence battles by lowering enemy armor with the use of bash cards and exploiting weaknesses, or by feeding spirits. Feeding can significantly turn the tide of battle, even to the point of turning some encounters that should be difficult into a cakewalk, provided of course players have the correct items to feed. I only fed enemies when I was sure that I couldn't win otherwise, because feeding a stat debuffing item to a spirit can lower an enemy that had 10 armor and almost 200 health into one that has 4 armor and 20 health. It ruins the balance of the game, as players should grow stat debuffing items, and it turns a playstyle that could be utilized into a strategy that is so optimal that players feel like they have to be using it. which is a disappointment because the game is already easy from a combat standpoint. I can recall only losing a battle twice in the 20 hours that I spent with the game, and these were mostly due to bringing weak spirits into a fight. I eventually would only initiate fights when I knew there was a chance to obtain rare materials, tame a spirit, or to fight a boss. Otherwise, combat was so trivial that it felt inconsequential to actually level up my spirits past any point, because I could just use a stat debuffing item and bring any foe that was above me to their knees in an instant. This is a shame, as combat is fun and can be satisfying when done correctly. I think if feeding enemy spirits was either balanced better to have them refuse from time to time, or only used for taming spirits, that would bring more relevancy to grinding. Speaking of, taming spirits wasn't very intuitive at first, but once I got the hang of it, became an aspect of the game that I started to enjoy. Taming them requires certain crops that, if fed to a wild spirit, will increase their tamed meter. Once this is maxed out, they will decide whether or not they want to join you. This can be done as many times as the player has energy to use. Breaking enemies' armor will not affect their decision, and in fact, players cannot feed a spirit that has been broken. So once a battle is started, if a spirit I have been searching for happened to be part of the enemy team, I would single out the spirit and feed it until it joined me. Generally, this was either so I could use it in future battles, or to keep it on my farm to get resources and do chores around my house. Moonstone Island is a game with clear strengths and faults in its mechanics both inside and outside of battle. However, there is something about this title that I just love. Between the characters and battles, I found myself constantly returning to it. It manages to stand out among its peers in the farming sim genre without feeling bloated or too different. It's a fresh take that I can't wait to see others have fun with. Noisy Pixel is giving Moonstone Island a 7.5 out of 10. Thanks for watching. This video is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon. Noisy Pixel is run by a group of gamers providing independent gaming coverage through news, reviews, previews, and more. Check out our Patreon to help support our continued growth, and subscribe to keep up with all of our future content.
Noisy Pixel.